At 58, Tom Greeley had buried more dreams than most men dare to have. The Texas rancher sat alone outside the auction house, staring at his empty coffee mug, the same chipped ceramic he'd used every morning for 3 years since Martha died. He wondered when life became nothing but empty routines. Inside that auction house, something was waiting that would change everything. A wounded wolf pup, trembling and half-starved in a crate, caught Tom's weathered eye. The auctioneer barely mentioned it. Damaged goods, they said. Against everyone's warnings, against common sense itself, Tom raised his hand and took the animal home. What started as simple compassion became something extraordinary. As the wolf healed, so did Tom, drawn from his isolation by this wild companion. Who understood his pain? This wasn't any ordinary rescue story. The pup's intelligence would lead Tom to uncover a dangerous wildlife trafficking ring operating right in his backyard. Could one lonely cowboy and his unlikely partner take down a criminal operation? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something special for you. The drive home from Millfield's livestock auction took Tom through 27 miles of mesquite and memory. His Ford pickup, rust-colored like the Texas dirt, knew these roads by heart. Past the Hendersons' place where the fence needed mending, past the old water tower that hadn't held water in a decade, past the crossroads where Martha used to wait. For him, on Friday evenings, when they were young and foolish enough to believe forever meant something. The Greeley Ranch spread across 800 acres of stubborn earth that his grandfather had claimed in 1952. Back then, it supported 3 families and enough cattle to make a living. Now it barely supported one broken-down widower and a dwindling herd. The Tom kept more out of habit than hope. The house sat like a weathered monument to better times. White clapboard siding gone grey, a wraparound porch that sagged on the east side, and windows that reflected nothing but sky. Tom pulled into the gravel driveway and cut the engine. The silence hit him the same way it did every evening, complete and unforgiving. No Martha calling from the kitchen, no children's voices echoing from the yard. No sounds except wind through dry grass and the distant lowing of cattle. He sat in the truck for a moment, listening to the engine tick as it cooled, before reaching for the small carrier beside him. The wolf pup hadn't made a sound during the drive. Tom had fashioned a bed from old towels, but the animal pressed itself. Against the far corner of the carrier, yellow eyes wide with terror and pain. One hind leg hung at an odd angle, and patches of fur were missing where infection had taken hold. Buck Morrison, who ran the auction house, had warned Tom he was buying trouble. "That thing ain't gonna make it through the night," Buck had said. Tobacco juice staining his grey beard. Save your $60 for something with 4 good legs. But Tom had seen something in those eyes. Recognition, maybe. The same hollow look he'd caught in his own reflection too many times lately. Inside the house, Tom's boots echoed on hardwood floors that Martha had insisted on refinishing their 2nd year of marriage. The walls held photographs spanning 30 years. Their wedding day, the kids' school pictures, family Christmases that seemed impossibly bright now. But it was the framed photograph on the mantel that stopped him cold every time he passed it. Sergeant Thomas J. Greeley, 1st Battalion, 75th Ranger Regiment, 24 years old, standing at attention in his dress uniform, chest decorated with ribbons that meant something back then. The bronze star caught the light from the window, a reminder of the man he'd been before arthritis settled in his knees and disappointment carved lines around his eyes. Before 2 tours in Afghanistan taught him that heroism was just another word for surviving when others didn't. That young soldier had married Martha Caldwell on a spring day in 1985, convinced he could build a life worth living on Texas soil. They dreamed of children who would carry on the family name, of Sunday dinners and Christmas mornings, of growing old together on the porch swing Tom had built with his own hands. Sarah had been their miracle baby, arriving after 5 years, of trying and 3 miscarriages that Martha never talked about, but never forgot. Jake followed 3 years later, completing their perfect family. For a while, the ranch had hummed with life. Children's laughter, Martha's singing while she cooked, the comfortable sounds of a home filled with love. But dreams have a way of crumbling like drought-stricken earth. Sarah married a corporate lawyer from Dallas and moved to a world of country clubs and private schools where her father's calloused hands embarrassed her. Jake joined the Navy and found his own version of purpose in distant oceans, coming home for duty visits that felt more like parole hearings. Martha held the family together through sheer force of will and Sunday phone calls that grew shorter each year. She planted flower gardens to attract butterflies, kept detailed journals about wildlife on the property, and never once complained about the isolation that was slowly swallowing her husband whole. When the cancer came, swift and merciless, she faced it the same way she'd faced everything else, with quiet dignity and unwavering faith that somehow things would work out. They didn't. The funeral drew more people than Tom expected. Neighbors he hadn't spoken to in years, fellow veterans from his American Legion post, Martha's book club ladies who brought enough casseroles to feed an army. Sarah flew in from Dallas with her 2 children, grandchildren who barely knew him. Jake got emergency leave and stood stiff in his Navy dress uniform, looking uncomfortable in his own skin. After the burial, after the visitors had gone home to their own lives, Tom found himself alone in a house that felt too big and too quiet. The silence had weight, pressing down on him like a physical presence. He started drinking his morning coffee on the porch instead of at the kitchen table where Martha's empty chair mocked him. He let the flower gardens go to seed because the butterflies reminded him too much of her gentle laughter. Dr. Elena Vasquez had been Martha's friend, not his. A veterinarian who'd moved to the area 5 years ago to escape city life, she'd bonded with Martha over their shared love of wildlife and conservation. Elena was practical and direct, with kind eyes and the patience to deal with stubborn ranchers who preferred treating their animals with whiskey and prayer rather than proper medicine. She'd tried to check on Tom after the funeral, bringing homemade tamales and gentle conversation. But grief made him churlish and rude, and eventually she'd stopped coming around. He regretted that now, staring at the injured pup who needed professional care. The ranch's finances reflected Tom's diminishing will to fight. Cattle prices had fallen, feed costs had risen, and the property taxes on 800 acres kept climbing despite the county's economic struggles. He'd sold off the north pasture 2 years ago to pay for Martha's medical bills. The east section had gone to cover funeral expenses. Now he was down to 400 acres and 40 head of cattle that barely paid for their own upkeep. His neighbors spoke to him with the careful politeness reserved for widowers and wounded animals. At the feed store, they asked about his health and the weather, steering clear of anything that might require actual conversation. Tom had become that fellow, the one people felt sorry for but didn't know how to help. The town of Millfield treated him like a relic from a more honorable time. Veterans thanked him for his service with the uncomfortable sincerity of people who'd never worn a uniform. The bank manager spoke to him in the gentle tones usually reserved for children and the elderly when discussing loan extensions. Even Buck Morrison, who'd known Tom for 20 years, handled him like fragile goods. Tom set the carrier down on the kitchen table and opened the latch. The pup didn't move, watching him with the wariness of something that had learned not to trust. Human hands. Tom understood that feeling. "Easy there, partner," he murmured, his voice rusty from disuse. "Nobody's gonna hurt you here." The kitchen smelled like old coffee and loneliness. Dishes sat in the sink because washing them meant acknowledging. He still had to eat, still had to go through the motions of living. The refrigerator hummed its monotonous song, interrupted only by the wall clock that Martha had insisted would help them stay on schedule. Tom reached into the carrier slowly, mindful of teeth that could do damage despite the animal's weakened state. The pup's fur was matted with dried blood and dirt, its breathing shallow and rapid. This close, he could see the intelligence in those yellow eyes, not the blank stare of a mindless animal, but the aware gaze of something that understood its circumstances. "You're hurt bad, aren't you?" Tom said softly. "But you're not ready to quit yet." I can see that. The pup's ears twitched at the sound of his voice, a small sign of trust that felt like a victory. Tom found an old blanket in the linen closet, one Martha had used for picnics when the kids were small. He arranged it in a cardboard box near the kitchen stove, creating a nest that might provide some comfort. When he lifted the pup from the carrier, it didn't struggle, though its body remained rigid with fear. As he settled the animal in its makeshift bed, Tom caught sight of his reflection in the kitchen window. Grey beard, lined face, eyes that had seen too much and hoped for too little, but something stirred in his chest as he watched the pup nose at the soft blanket, a feeling he'd almost forgotten. Purpose. For the first time in 3 years, something needed him. Outside, the sun was setting behind the mesquite, painting the sky in shades of orange and red that Martha would have called God's watercolors. Tom pulled his phone from his pocket and scrolled through the contacts until he found Dr. Vasquez's number. His thumb hovered over the call button for a long moment before he pressed it. The phone rang twice before her familiar voice answered. Elena Vasquez. Doc, it's Tom Greeley. He paused, searching for words that wouldn't sound foolish. I need your help with something. The concern in Elena's voice cut through 3 years of awkward distance. Tom, is everything all right? I've got an injured animal here, Doc. Wolf pup, maybe 3 months old. Found it at Morrison's auction. Tom looked down at the small form curled in the blanket, ribs showing through matted fur. It's hurt bad. A pause on the other end, then Elena's professional tone kicked in. Tom, you know I can't treat wild animals without proper permits. And wolves. It's dying, Elena. The words came out harder than he intended. Whatever paperwork needs signing, we'll handle it later. Another pause. Longer this time. Tom could almost hear her weighing protocols against compassion. The same calculation he'd made 100 times in field hospitals overseas. How bad is it? Tom examined the pup more closely, his hands remembering techniques learned in military medic training 30 years ago. Malnutrition, infected wounds on the back legs, possible broken bone, dehydrated. Temperature feels low. Can you bring it to the clinic? Tom looked at the trembling animal. Moving it again seemed cruel. I'd rather not stress it any more than necessary. Could you come out here? Silence stretched between them until Eleanor sighed. Give me an hour to get my kit together. And Tom, don't try to treat it yourself. Just keep it warm and quiet. But Tom was already moving toward the hall closet where he kept supplies that most ranchers accumulated over decades of caring for livestock. Behind the veterinary medications and cattle supplements, pushed to the back like a secret shame, sat an old cigar box he hadn't opened since Martha's illness. The box contained his makeshift medical kit, items he'd gathered during those last months when every small comfort might make a difference. Sterile gauze, antiseptic solution, disposable syringes, antibiotic ointment, elastic bandages, and a digital thermometer. He'd assembled it piece by piece, buying supplies at different pharmacies so no one would ask questions about why a rancher needed medical equipment meant for humans. Tom carried the box to the kitchen table and opened it with the reverence of a man handling sacred relics. The smell of antiseptic brought back memories of field hospitals in Kandahar, of holding pressure on wounds while helicopters thundered overhead, of learning that sometimes keeping someone alive was just a matter of refusing to give up. The pups. Eyes followed his movements with that unsettling intelligence he'd noticed at the auction. Most injured animals retreated into themselves, conserving energy for survival. This one watched and assessed, as if calculating Tom's intentions. Easy now, Tom murmured, pulling on disposable gloves with the careful precision of old training. Let's see what we're dealing with here. The examination revealed the extent of the damage. The left hind leg bore deep puncture wounds that had festered, creating an infection that smelled of decay and neglect. The right leg appeared fractured, bent at an unnatural angle. The pup's gums were pale, and its coat lacked the luster of healthy fur. Worst of all were its ribs, visible beneath the skin like a topographical map of starvation. Tom had seen this before in war zones, the look of something that had been abandoned, left to survive on its own resources until those resources ran out. The difference was that soldiers chose their battles. This pup had been dealt its hand by circumstance, or more likely, human cruelty. Working with the gentle efficiency that had earned him commendations in Afghanistan, Tom cleaned the wounds with antiseptic solution. The pup flinched but didn't snap, even when the disinfectant must have burned like fire. Its stoicism reminded him of young Marines trying not to show pain while medics worked on their injuries. "You're a tough little bastard, aren't you?" Tom said softly, applying antibiotic ointment to the infected areas. "Somebody hurt you bad, but you're not ready to quit." As he worked, memories surfaced unbidden. Private Rodriguez, 19 years old, holding Tom's hand while combat surgeons tried to save what was left of his legs after an IED explosion. Sergeant Mills, calling for his mother while Tom applied pressure to a chest wound that was bleeding. Faster than they could stop it. The weight of responsibility that came with having someone's life depend on your skill and steady hands. He'd been good at it once. The emergency medicine that kept people breathing until better help arrived. Martha used to say he had healing hands, meant for fixing things that were broken. He'd lost faith in that gift somewhere between her diagnosis and her funeral. But muscle memory was a stubborn thing. Tom fashioned a splint from a wooden ruler and medical tape, immobilizing the fractured leg with the careful precision of a man who'd done this before. The pup tolerated the procedure with remarkable patience, occasionally meeting Tom's eyes with what looked almost like gratitude. By the time Eleanor's headlights swept across the kitchen window, Tom had done everything his limited medical knowledge allowed. The pup was clean, bandaged, and wrapped in warm blankets. A shallow dish of water sat within reach, though the animal hadn't yet tried to drink. Elena knocked softly before entering, carrying a professional veterinary kit that made Tom's cigar box supplies look primitive. She'd changed from her evening clothes into scrubs, her dark hair pulled back in a practical ponytail that emphasized the worry lines around her eyes. "Jesus, Tom," she breathed, seeing the pup. "Where did you find this poor thing?" "Morrison's auction. They had it crated with some rabbits and chickens. Nobody seemed to know where it came from." Elena set down her kit and pulled on examination gloves, her movements practiced and efficient. "This isn't right. Wolves aren't livestock, and they're certainly not auction animals. Did Buck say who brought it in?" "Said he didn't know. Somebody dropped off the crate this morning, paid the listing fee and left." Tom watched Elena's face as she examined his work. "I cleaned the wounds and splinted the leg. Figured that was better than waiting." "You did. Good work," Elena admitted, testing the splint's stability. "Military training?" "Combat medic certification. Long time ago." Elena nodded, understanding passing between them like a shared language. She'd treated enough veterans to recognize the careful competence that came from battlefield experience. "The infection is serious, but you caught it in time. The fracture is clean, should heal well if we can keep it immobilized." She prepared a syringe with antibiotics, her movements gentle but confident. The pup watched her approach without the wild panic Tom had expected. Instead, it seemed to understand that this was help arriving. "This is what bothers me," Eleanor said, administering the injection. "Look at how calm it is. Wild wolves, especially. Injured ones fight like demons when handled by humans. This one acts almost domesticated. What are you thinking?" "I'm thinking somebody had this animal in captivity. The malnutrition suggests neglect, not wild living. And these wounds," she pointed to the puncture marks on the hind leg, "these look like bite marks from a larger dog, like it was being bullied by other animals in close quarters." Tom felt something cold settle in his stomach, like it was being kept somewhere it shouldn't have been. "Exactly." Elena's voice carried the authority of professional expertise. "This pup was raised by humans, Tom. The question is why and how it ended up at a livestock auction with no documentation." They worked in companionable silence, Elena administering fluids through a subcutaneous injection, while Tom held the pup steady. The animal's breathing grew stronger as warmth and medication began to work their healing magic. "He'll need round-the-clock care for the next few days," Elena said, packing up her equipment. "Antibiotics every 8 hours, pain medication as needed." I'll come back tomorrow to check on him. Him, Elena smiled, the first genuine expression Tom had seen from her since Martha's funeral. Definitely male. And based on the bone structure and coat markings, I'd guess he's got some domestic dog mixed in with the wolf, probably bred specifically for the exotic pet trade. After Elena left, promising to research the legal requirements for keeping a wolf hybrid, Tom settled into a chair beside the makeshift bed. The pup, he was already thinking of him as Scout, though he couldn't say why, slept fitfully, occasionally whimpering in dreams that were probably filled with pain and fear. Tom dozed in the chair, waking every hour to check on his patient. During one of those quiet watches, as moonlight streamed through the kitchen window, Scout opened his eyes and looked directly at Tom. For a long moment they regarded each other across the species divide, two damaged souls recognizing something familiar. Tom reached out slowly, offering the back of his hand. Scout sniffed cautiously, then pressed his nose against Tom's fingers in a gesture that felt like acceptance. "We're going to figure this out, partner," Tom whispered. "Whatever happened to you, whoever hurt you, we're going to make it right." Outside, a coyote howled in the distance, the sound carrying across empty pastures like a warning. Tom thought about Elena's words, about the implications of finding a wolf hybrid at a livestock auction with no documentation. Something illegal was happening, something that had left this innocent animal broken and abandoned. For the first time in 3 years, Tom Greeley felt the stirring of a purpose that had nothing to do with mere survival. Scout needed him, and maybe, just maybe, he needed Scout just as much. The first week passed in a rhythm Tom hadn't experienced since Martha's illness. The structured cadence of caring for something more fragile than himself. Every 4 hours, he administered antibiotics and checked Scout's temperature. Twice daily, he changed bandages with the methodical precision of a man who understood that healing required patience as much as medicine. Scout proved to be a patient that defied every expectation. Where Tom anticipated wild behavior, he found watchful cooperation. Where he expected fear, he discovered a cautious intelligence that seemed to evaluate each situation before responding. By the 3rd day, when Tom approached with medication, Scout would lift his head expectantly rather than cowering in the blanket. "You're something special, aren't you?" Tom murmured during one of their quiet sessions. "Most animals your age would be bouncing off the walls by now." The name came naturally on the 4th day, when Tom noticed how Scout's ears swiveled toward sounds beyond human hearing. The distant rumble of a neighbor's tractor, the approach of Elena's truck long before. It appeared in the driveway, even the subtle changes in Tom's footsteps that preceded mealtimes. Scout observed everything with the focused attention of a military reconnaissance specialist, cataloging information with systematic thoroughness. "Scout," Tom said aloud, testing how the name felt. "Yeah, that fits you." As if understanding Scout's tail gave a small wag, the first truly positive response Tom had seen from the healing animal. The daily routines that centered around Scout's care began to reshape Tom's existence in ways he hadn't anticipated. He woke earlier, energized by purpose rather than dragged from sleep by habit. His morning coffee tasted better when shared with a companion who watched his movements with genuine interest. Even mundane tasks like preparing meals took on new meaning when someone depended on his consistency. Elena visited every other day, monitoring Scout's progress with the satisfaction of a professional watching her work succeed. The infection cleared steadily under the assault of antibiotics, and careful wound care. The fractured leg showed signs of proper healing, though Scout would need several more weeks of restricted movement. His response to treatment is remarkable, Elena noted during her Friday visit, running practiced hands over Scout's improving form. But what fascinates me most is his behavior. Look how he watches us. Tom followed her gaze to Scout, who was indeed observing their conversation with an attention that seemed almost human in its focus. When Elena spoke, Scout's head tilted slightly, as if parsing the meaning behind her words. When she moved to examine his bandages, he shifted position to accommodate her without being asked. "It's like he understands what we're trying to do," Tom said. "More than that. It's like he's learning our routines so he can participate in his own recovery. Elena scratched behind Scout's ears, earning a contented rumble that was part growl, part purr. I've been doing some research on wolf-dog hybrids. The intelligent ones can be trained to a level that rivals working dogs, but they need mental stimulation or they become destructive. He doesn't seem destructive because he's still weak. Wait until he gets his strength back, then we'll see what kind of mind we're dealing with. That evening, buoyed by Scout's progress and Elena's encouraging words, Tom made a decision he'd been postponing for months. He pulled out his phone and scrolled to Sarah's number, thumb hovering over the call button the same way it had 3 years ago, when he'd needed to tell his children their mother was dying. The phone rang 4 times before Sarah's familiar voice answered, crisp with professional efficiency. "Hi, Dad. Is everything okay?" The question stung because it implied that only emergencies warranted contact between them. Tom supposed he'd earned that assumption through years of stilted conversations and missed birthdays. "Everything's fine, sweetheart. I just wanted to hear your voice." A pause that stretched long enough for Tom to hear muffled voices in the background. Sarah's. Husband talking to their children about homework or chores or the countless details that filled suburban family life. "That's nice, Dad. How are you feeling?" Tom looked across the kitchen at Scout, who was watching him with those unsettling yellow eyes. "Better than I have in a while, actually. I've got some company out here." "Company?" Sarah's tone carried the careful neutrality she'd perfected for handling her father's eccentricities. "Did you hire some help around the ranch?" "Not exactly." Tom found himself smiling for the first time in the conversation. "I rescued a wolf pup from Morrison's auction, been nursing him back to health." The silence on the other end stretched, so long that Tom wondered if the call had dropped. Finally, Sarah's voice returned, tight with the patience of someone dealing with a difficult relative. "Dad, that doesn't sound safe. Wild animals can carry diseases, and if it's injured, it might be unpredictable." "He's not unpredictable. Smart as a whip, actually. Follows commands. Seems to understand commands." "Dad, you can't train a wolf like a dog, and what happens when it gets bigger? Those animals can weigh 150 pounds. Tom felt the conversation slipping away from him, devolving into the familiar pattern of Sarah's worried practicality clashing with what she saw as his impulsive decision-making. "Sarah, if you could see him, I think you should call animal control and have them relocate it to a proper sanctuary. This isn't fair to the animal, and it's not safe for you." After they hung up, Sarah citing homework supervision as her excuse. To end the call, Tom sat in his kitchen, feeling the familiar weight of family disappointment. He'd hoped that sharing something positive might bridge the distance between them. But instead, he'd only confirmed Sarah's belief that her father was becoming increasingly isolated and irrational. "She thinks I'm losing it, Scout," Tom said, reaching down to stroke the pup's head. "Maybe she's right." Scout responded by pressing his nose against Tom's palm, a gesture that felt like reassurance. Over the next few days, as Scout's strength returned, his unusual intelligence became impossible to ignore. He learned to ring a small bell Tom had hung by the door when he needed to go outside. He distinguished between the sounds of different vehicles, becoming alert when Elena's truck approached, but remaining calm when neighbors passed on the county road. Most remarkably, he seemed to understand the rhythm of Tom's daily routine, positioning himself near the medication cabinet when it was time for his antibiotics. "It's like living with a very polite, very smart person who happens to have 4 legs, Tom told Elena during her Tuesday visit. "I've been thinking about that," Elena said, watching Scout carefully navigate the kitchen despite his splinted leg. "This level of intelligence suggests serious selective breeding. Someone didn't just cross a wolf with a random domestic dog, they were trying to create something specific. For what purpose? That's what worries me. The exotic pet trade has a market for animals that look wild but behave like domesticated pets. Rich people pay enormous amounts for designer wolves." Tom was reaching for Scout's afternoon medication when the phone rang. He didn't recognize the number on the display, but caller ID showed it was local. "Greeley Ranch," he answered. "You picked Up something that don't belong to you." The voice was male, gravelly, with an accent Tom couldn't place. "Smart thing would be to mind your own business." "Who is this?" "Somebody who knows where you live, old man. That animal you took from Morrison's auction, it's spoken for. Best return it before you get yourself into trouble you can't handle." The line went dead. Tom stared at the phone for a long moment, adrenaline coursing through his system with familiar intensity. He'd heard that tone before, in places where threats weren't idle, and strangers who knew your address meant serious business. Scout had gone still during the conversation, ears pricked forward, body tense with awareness that something had changed. In the room's atmosphere, when Tom looked down, those intelligent yellow eyes met his with an expression that seemed almost like understanding. Tom walked to the kitchen window and scanned the horizon, military instincts automatically cataloguing. Sight lines and approach routes. His father's hand-carved walking stick leaned against the wall beside the door, a gnarled piece of mesquite that the old man had shaped during long evenings on the porch. Tom picked it up, feeling the smooth wood worn by decades of use, and stepped outside. The ranch spread before him in familiar patterns of pasture and fence line, but now he saw it with different eyes. The barn offered concealment for anyone wanting to approach unseen. The grove of oak trees near the property line could hide a vehicle. The county road provided easy access and quick escape routes. He'd underestimated the situation. This wasn't just about one abandoned animal. It was about something larger, more organized. Someone had been using Scout for a purpose, and they wanted him back badly enough to make threats. Tom returned to the kitchen, where Scout was watching him with that uncanny awareness. "Looks like we've got ourselves some trouble, partner. Question is, what are we going to do about it?" As if in response, Scout struggled to his feet despite the splint, positioning himself between Tom and the door. The message was clear. Whatever was coming, they would face it together. The threatening phone call changed everything. Tom found himself checking the locks on doors that hadn't been secured in years, positioning himself near windows where he could observe approaches to the house and listening to the night sounds with the hypervigilance of a soldier in hostile territory. Scout seemed to sense the shift in atmosphere, rarely leaving Tom's side and maintaining an alertness that suggested he too understood they were no longer safe. 3 days after the call, Scout did something that convinced Tom the pup was far more than an ordinary animal. While Tom was feeding the cattle in the south pasture, Scout began exhibiting behavior he'd never shown before, pacing in tight circles, whining softly, and looking toward a section of the property Tom rarely visited. "What's got you worked up, partner?" Tom asked, but Scout continued his anxious display. Finally, the pup began limping determinedly toward the tree line, despite his splintered leg making the journey difficult. Every few yards he would stop and look back at Tom, clearly expecting to be followed. Tom had learned to trust Scout's instincts. He grabbed his father's walking stick and followed the determined animal into the mesquite grove that bordered his eastern property line. Scout navigated the rough terrain with surprising skill, leading Tom along what appeared to be a faint path worn through the underbrush. After 20 minutes of careful walking, they emerged in a small clearing that Tom hadn't visited in years. What he found there made his blood run cold. Fresh tire tracks crisscrossed the bare earth, and scattered among the dried grass were remnants of human activity, empty water bottles, cigarette butts, and most telling of all, pieces of wire mesh and broken wooden slats that looked like parts of animal crates. Scout sniffed the debris with intense focus before moving to a spot near a large oak tree where someone had attempted to bury something. Tom used his walking stick to probe the loose earth, uncovering more evidence of organized activity. Rope, fragments, torn canvas that might have been part of a tarp, and a metal tag with numbers stamped on it, the kind used for livestock identification, but somehow different. "Jesus," Tom muttered, scanning the clearing with new eyes. The location was perfect for clandestine operations, hidden from the road, accessible by vehicles that could approach through the neighboring ranch's back roads, and remote enough that noise wouldn't carry to any houses. Scout moved to another area of the clearing, where the ground showed signs of multiple vehicles. Tom counted at least 4 different tire patterns, suggesting this wasn't the work of casual hunters or teenagers looking for a place to party. This was organized, systematic, and professional. The military training that had been dormant for decades suddenly came flooding back. Tom found himself automatically cataloging details, sightlines, escape routes, defensive positions. He'd seen setups like this in Afghanistan, places where different groups met to conduct business they didn't want. Observed, staging areas, transfer points. Scout's discovery took on a sinister new meaning. If this clearing had been used for wildlife trafficking, and Scout had somehow escaped from one of their operations, then the threatening phone call wasn't just intimidation. It was a promise. When Elena arrived for her scheduled visit that afternoon, Tom was waiting for her with questions that had been building all day. How long would it take for a wolf pup to lose its fear of humans if it was raised in captivity? He asked, before she'd even set down her medical kit. Elena studied his face, noting the tension that hadn't been there during her previous visits. Depends on the circumstances, but with proper handling from birth, maybe 6 to 8 weeks. Why? Scout's too comfortable around people, too understanding of human behavior. Tom described what they'd found in the clearing, watching Elena's expression grow increasingly concerned. Tom, this sounds like a professional operation. Wildlife trafficking is big business, and the people involved don't appreciate interference. But Scout escaped somehow, or was abandoned. More likely, he was part of a shipment that went wrong. These operations move animals quickly, from capture or breeding facilities to buyers. If something spooked them, they might have ditched evidence and planned to come back later. Elena knelt beside Scout, examining him with the systematic thoroughness of someone looking for specific details. Look at his teeth, Tom. See how even they are? Wild wolves have chipped teeth from gnawing bones and fighting. His are perfect, like he's been fed soft food his whole life. She moved to his paws, spreading the toes to examine the pads. No wear from running on rocks or hard ground. This animal has spent most of his life in controlled conditions. The implications settled over Tom like a cold fog. Scout hadn't just been abandoned, he was evidence of criminal activity, and someone wanted him back badly enough to threaten violence. That evening, as Tom was closing the barn after evening chores, he heard the rumble of an engine approaching along the county road. Instead of passing by, the vehicle slowed and turned into his driveway. Tom positioned himself where he could see the approaching truck, while remaining partially concealed by the barn door. 2 men climbed out of a late-model pickup, both wearing hunting clothes and carrying themselves with the casual confidence of people accustomed to intimidating others. The driver was tall and lean, with greying hair beneath a camouflage cap. His passenger was younger, broader, with the kind of thick neck that suggested time spent in a gym. "You Tom Greeley?" the older man called out, not bothering to approach. "The house. This is private property," Tom replied, stepping into view but keeping his distance. "You're trespassing. Just want to have a friendly conversation about that animal you picked up at Morrison's place. Seems there was a misunderstanding about ownership." "No misunderstanding. I paid for it fair and square." The younger man shifted position, and Tom noticed the bulge beneath his hunting jacket that suggested a shoulder holster. These weren't ordinary hunters. "That animal's got sentimental value," the older man continued. "We'd be willing to pay you double what you spent at the auction." "Not interested." The older man's friendly demeanor slipped slightly. "Maybe you didn't understand the phone call the other day. Sometimes old folks get confused about what's in their best interest." Tom felt the familiar calm that had kept him alive in combat, the slowing of time and sharpening of focus that came when diplomacy ended and survival began. "I understand perfectly. Now get off my property." Both men stared at him for a long moment, clearly reassessing their approach. Tom stood perfectly still, using silence as a weapon the way his instructors had taught him decades ago. Finally, the older man shrugged. "Suit yourself, old-timer, but accidents happen out here in the country, especially to folks living alone." They climbed back into their truck and drove away, leaving Tom standing in his driveway with adrenaline coursing through his system and the certainty that this was far from over. The next morning brought an unexpected arrival, Sarah's silver sedan pulling into the driveway with the urgent purpose of someone on a mission. Tom watched from the kitchen window as his daughter emerged wearing the crisp business attire that made her look older than her 35 years. Sarah knocked on the door rather than walking in, a formality that highlighted the distance between them. When Tom opened it, he found her studying his face with the analytical expression she'd inherited from her mother. "Dad, I came as soon as I could get away from work. I've been worried about you since our phone call. Come in, sweetheart." Tom stepped aside, suddenly conscious of how the kitchen looked. Scout's makeshift bed by the stove, medical supplies on the counter, the general air of a man whose life had taken an unexpected turn. Sarah's eyes found Scout immediately, and her expression softened despite her concerns. "Oh, Dad, he's beautiful." Scout looked up at the new arrival with calm interest, neither cowering nor showing aggression. After a moment he approached Sarah and sniffed her extended hand before sitting politely at her feet. "He's so well-behaved," Sarah said, surprise evident in her voice. "Too well-behaved, according to Elena. We think he was raised in captivity by people who knew what they were doing." As Tom explained the situation, the threatening phone call, the discovery in the clearing, the visit from the two men, he watched. Sarah's expression cycled through disbelief, concern, and finally fear. "Dad, you have to call the police. These people are dangerous." "And tell them what? That I found some trash in the woods and got a threatening phone call? They'll say it's a civil matter and suggest I hire a lawyer." Sarah was quiet for a long moment, watching Scout with the careful attention she'd once brought to difficult legal problems. "This isn't just about the wolf anymore, is it?" "No," Tom admitted. "It's about doing what's right, and maybe about remembering who I used to be, before I forgot how to fight for anything that mattered." Sarah looked at her father, really looked at him, and saw something she hadn't expected. The defeated posture was gone, replaced by the straight-back bearing of a soldier. His eyes had lost their vacant sadness and taken on the focused alertness of a man with a mission. "I'm scared for you," she said quietly. "I'm scared too," Tom replied. "But Scout needs protection, and apparently so do other animals these people are trafficking. Sometimes being scared means you're paying attention." That night, after Sarah had returned to Dallas with promises to call daily and threats to involve the authorities herself if necessary, Tom sat in his kitchen with Scout at his feet and Martha's leather-bound journal open on the table. He'd found it while looking for maps of the property, and what he'd discovered inside had shaken him to his core. Martha had been documenting strange activities for months before her death. Unusual vehicle traffic on neighboring roads, reports from other ranchers about missing livestock, and most disturbing of all, her own observations about wildlife disappearances on their property. "May 15th, he read aloud to Scout. "Found another set of tracks near the east fence line. Something big, moving in groups. Tom says it's probably coyotes, but coyotes don't move in formation like this." The entries continued, painting a picture of Martha's growing concern about organized criminal activity in their area. The final entry, dated just 2 weeks before her diagnosis, sent ice through Tom's veins. "I think they know I've been watching. The same truck has driven past the house 3 times this week, slowing down each time. I should tell Tom, but he's been so distant lately. Maybe I should call Elena instead." Martha had known. She'd been investigating the same operation that had produced Scout, and she'd been scared enough to consider reaching out for help. Tom closed the journal with trembling hands, finally understanding that his wife's death might not have been the random cruelty of cancer, but something far more sinister. Scout pressed against his leg, offering comfort that felt like a promise. Whatever had happened to Martha, whatever these people were doing to innocent animals, Tom was going to make it right, even if it killed him. Martha's journal changed everything. Tom spent a sleepless night reading and rereading her entries, each one painting a clearer picture of an operation that had been using his property as a staging ground while he remained oblivious. The guilt was crushing. His wife had died knowing something was wrong, and he'd been too wrapped up in his own misery to listen. By dawn, he'd made a decision that would have seemed impossible just a week earlier. He was going to find out exactly what had happened on his land, and he was going to stop it. The storage closet in the back bedroom hadn't been opened since he'd packed away his military gear after Martha's funeral. Behind boxes of Christmas decorations and old photo albums, wrapped in canvas and preserved with the care of a man who'd once depended on his equipment for survival, lay the remnants of Sergeant Tom Greeley's war kit. The night vision goggles were military surplus from his Afghanistan deployment, older technology by current standards, but still functional. Tom tested the battery pack and adjusted the head strap, muscle memory guiding his hands through procedures he'd practiced thousands of times in hostile territory. The weight felt familiar, comforting in the way that old tools comfort craftsmen. Scout watched the preparations with intense interest, seeming to understand that something significant was happening. When Tom put on dark clothing and began checking his equipment, the pup struggled to his feet despite his healing leg. "Not tonight, partner," Tom said gently. "Your job is to heal. Mine is to figure out what we're dealing with." But Scout had other ideas. He positioned himself by the door with unmistakable determination, yellow eyes reflecting Tom's flashlight beam with stubborn resolve. Tom considered the situation. Scout knew this property better than any bloodhound, and his unusual intelligence might prove valuable. Against his better judgment, he found an old towel and fashioned a sling that would support Scout's splintered leg while allowing him to move. "All right, but we do this my way. Quiet, careful, and if I say run, you run." They left the house at midnight, moving through familiar terrain that looked alien under the green wash of night vision. Tom had patrolled these pastures for 30 years, but he'd never noticed how many concealed approaches existed, how many blind spots could hide observers or intruders. Scout moved beside him with surprising stealth, instinctively understanding the need for silence. The clearing where they'd found evidence of trafficking activity showed fresh signs of use. New tire tracks, cigarette butts that still held the smell of recent smoking, and drag marks that suggested heavy objects had been moved. Tom photographed everything with a digital camera modified for low-light operation, documenting the scene with the thoroughness of someone who understood that evidence might be the difference between justice and cover-up. Scout led him to areas Tom would never have found alone. Game trails that had been widened for human use, natural clearings that showed signs of recent vehicle access, and most disturbing of all, a camouflaged blind that offered perfect surveillance of Tom's house. Someone had been watching him. For how long, he couldn't determine, but the sophisticated construction of the hide suggested this wasn't casual observation. This was professional reconnaissance, the kind of surveillance that preceded operational planning. Tom's hands shook slightly as he photographed the blind, not from fear, but from anger. These people had violated more than his property. They'd invaded his privacy, studied his routines, and probably planned his intimidation with the cold calculation of predators. Selecting prey. Over the next 3 nights, Tom and Scout conducted systematic reconnaissance of the entire property. What they discovered confirmed his worst suspicions. His ranch was part of a larger network. Established routes connected his land to neighboring properties, creating corridors that allowed movement without using public roads. The operation was sophisticated, patient, and probably worth millions of dollars. Sarah called every evening as promised, and Tom found himself looking forward to conversations that gradually moved beyond worried formalities. When he described his nighttime investigations, carefully omitting the most dangerous details, he heard something in his daughter's voice he hadn't heard in years. "Respect. You're different, Dad," she said during their Thursday evening call. "You sound like yourself again." "I feel like myself again," Tom admitted, "maybe for the first time since your mother died. This is dangerous, though. Promise me you're not taking unnecessary risks." Tom looked across the kitchen at Scout, who was listening to the conversation with that uncanny awareness. "I'm being careful, sweetheart, but some things are worth the risk." Eleanor became his crucial ally when he shared Martha's journal and his surveillance photographs. Her professional network of veterinarians, wildlife rehabilitators, and conservation officers provided access to information that confirmed the scope of the trafficking operation. "This is bigger than I thought," she told him over coffee on Friday morning, spreading documents across his kitchen table. "I've been making discreet inquiries, and several veterinarians in the area have reported suspicious requests for services. Someone's been trying to buy antibiotics and surgical supplies without proper documentation. For the animals they're trafficking? That's my guess. They need medical support to keep valuable specimens alive during transport." Elena pointed to one of Tom's photographs showing tire tracks. "These patterns suggest heavy vehicles, trucks or large vans designed for hauling livestock. How do we stop them? We need more evidence, something solid enough to convince law enforcement to take this seriously." Elena's expression was grim. "And we need to be careful. These people have too much invested to walk away quietly." That afternoon brought Jake's arrival, unannounced and clearly concerned by his sister's phone calls. Tom hadn't seen his son in 2 years, and the reunion was awkward, with unspoken tensions and the careful politeness of men who'd hurt each other without meaning to. Jake was 32, a Navy electronics technician, with his father's broad shoulders and his mother's practical intelligence. He'd inherited Tom's tendency to retreat when emotions ran high, which had made their relationship particularly difficult after Martha's death. "Sarah says you've adopted a wolf," Jake said, setting down a duffel bag that suggested he planned to stay. "Scout's not exactly adopted, more like we're helping each other out." Jake's skepticism evaporated the moment he met Scout. The pup approached him with the same calm assessment he'd shown Sarah, studying Jake for a long moment before, accepting a cautious head scratch. "He's not what I expected," Jake admitted. "Nothing about this situation is what I expected." Tom showed Jake the evidence they'd gathered, watching his son's expression shift from concern to professional interest. Navy electronics training had taught Jake to recognize sophisticated operations, and what he saw in the photographs clearly impressed him. "Dad, this is organized crime-level stuff. You're talking about people with serious resources and connections." "I know. So why not turn everything over to the FBI and let them handle it?" Tom considered the question carefully. "Because by the time federal agents get organized and coordinate with local law enforcement, these people will have cleaned up their operation and moved somewhere else. Other animals will suffer, and Martha's death will remain just another statistic." Jake studied his father's face, seeing something he remembered from childhood, the quiet determination that had made Tom Greeley someone his fellow soldiers followed into combat. "What do you need me to do?" The answer came that evening, when the traffickers made their most direct threat yet. Tom was showing Jake the hidden blind when Scout suddenly went rigid, ears forward and hackles raised. Seconds later, Tom's enhanced hearing caught the sound of approaching vehicles. They took cover in the tree line as 2 trucks approached the clearing, headlights cutting through the darkness. Tom counted 6 men, all armed, all moving with the disciplined coordination of professionals. Through his night vision scope, he recognized the 2 men who'd visited his ranch earlier. "Spread out and search," the older man ordered. "That old bastard's been snooping around, and I want to know what he's found." Tom and Jake remained motionless as the search team swept the area with military precision. These weren't casual criminals. They were trained operators who understood tactical movement and zone clearance. Scout pressed against Tom's leg, every muscle coiled for action despite his healing injuries. When one of the searchers approached their hiding spot, the pup's lips pulled back in a silent snarl that revealed teeth designed for more than show. The searcher passed within 10 feet of their position without detecting them, but Tom understood the message. The next encounter wouldn't be a casual threat or attempted intimidation. These people were prepared for violence, and they were running out of patience. After the trucks departed, Jake was quiet for a long moment. "Dad, these aren't local criminals. This is something bigger, more dangerous than anything we can handle alone." "Maybe," Tom agreed, "but they made one mistake." "What's that?" Tom looked down at Scout, whose yellow eyes seemed to glow with intelligence and determination. They underestimated what happens when you threaten someone's family. Jake followed his father's gaze to the loyal animal who'd already proven he would risk everything to protect the man who'd saved his life. You're talking about Scout. I'm talking about all of us, Tom replied. They want a fight, they've got one, but it's going to be on our terms, not theirs. As they made their way back to the house, Tom felt something he hadn't experienced since Martha's death, the fierce joy of having something worth fighting for. Scout limped beside him with unwavering loyalty. Jake walked with the confidence of a man who'd found his purpose, and somewhere in the distance, their enemies were discovering that Tom Greeley was no longer the broken widower they'd been counting. And the war was about to begin. For the first time in 3 years, the dining room table was cleared of dust and set for a family meal. Martha had always insisted that important conversations happened over food, and as Tom looked at the familiar oak surface where his children had done homework, carved initials, and shared countless family dinners, he understood why she'd been right. Jake had driven to town for supplies, returning with laptops, maps, and the kind of organizational materials that turned amateur investigation into systematic intelligence gathering. Sarah had arrived from Dallas that afternoon, bringing legal expertise and the kind of methodical thinking that made her successful in corporate law. Scout positioned himself at the corner of the table where he could observe everyone while remaining out of the way, a tactical choice that reminded Tom of soldiers who instinctively selected positions offering maximum situational awareness. The pup's intelligence continued to evolve, and Tom found himself including Scout in planning discussions as if he were another team member. "All right," Sarah said, opening her laptop and spreading documents across the table. "If we're going to do this properly, we need to approach it like building a legal case. Evidence, witnesses, documentation." Jake nodded, pulling up aerial photographs on his tablet. "I've been studying the property boundaries and access routes. Dad's right about this being part of a larger network. Look at this." He highlighted routes connecting Tom's ranch to 3 neighboring properties, creating corridors that avoided main roads and residential areas. This isn't random. Someone spent time planning these routes for maximum stealth and efficiency. Tom studied the maps with professional interest. In Afghanistan, we called patterns like this rat lines, established routes for moving personnel and supplies without detection. This has the same level of sophistication. "Tell us about that," Sarah said, looking at her father with new attention. "Your military experience. What did you actually do over there?" Tom was quiet for a moment, unused to talking about things he'd spent decades trying to forget. Scout sensed the shift in his mood and moved closer, offering silent support. "I was part of a specialized unit that conducted reconnaissance and direct action missions," Tom finally said. "We'd go into hostile territory, gather intelligence, and sometimes eliminate targets that conventional forces couldn't reach. The skills, transfer, surveillance, planning, understanding how criminal organizations operate." Jake leaned forward with genuine interest. "What made you good at it?" "Patience, understanding that rushing gets people killed, and learning to think like the enemy, to predict their moves by understanding their motivations." Tom looked around the table at his family. These traffickers have patterns, weaknesses. They're operating in familiar territory, which makes them confident but also predictable. Elena arrived as they were reviewing Tom's surveillance photographs, bringing news that confirmed their worst fears. "I've been coordinating with wildlife rehabilitation centers across 3 states, she said, accepting Sarah's offer of coffee. "The scope of this operation is staggering." She spread her own documents across the table. Veterinary reports, suspicious animal seizures, and correspondence from rehabilitation centers dealing with unusual cases. In the past 2 years, there's been a systematic increase in exotic animal trafficking through this region. Wolves, mountain lions, even some endangered species that shouldn't exist in private hands. "How much money are we talking about?" Jake asked. "A prime wolf-dog hybrid like Scout can sell for $10,000 to $15,000. Rare big cats bring $50,000 or more. If they're moving even a dozen animals per month, that's potentially millions annually." Sarah made notes on her laptop. building the foundation of a case that could eventually reach federal prosecutors. That explains the sophistication and the threats. They're protecting a substantial investment. Tom watched his family work together with growing pride. Jake's technical expertise, Sarah's legal training, and Elena's professional network were combining into something more formidable than he could have achieved alone. Even Scout contributed, occasionally alerting them to sounds beyond human hearing, distant vehicles, approaching aircraft, or changes in the night's rhythm that suggested surveillance. "There's something else," Elena said, hesitating before continuing. "I sent DNA samples from Scout's blood work to a laboratory that specializes in exotic animal genetics. The results are disturbing." She pulled out a folder containing scientific reports that looked more like classified documents than veterinary records. Scout isn't just a wolf-dog hybrid. He's been selectively bred for specific traits: intelligence, temperament, and physical characteristics that make him valuable as an exotic pet. Tom felt ice settle in his stomach, meaning someone invested significant time and money in creating him. This wasn't accidental breeding. It was genetic engineering for commercial purposes. Scout represents thousands of dollars in research and development. The implications hung over the table like a storm cloud. Scout wasn't just evidence of criminal activity. He was valuable property that someone would go to extreme lengths to recover. "They're not going to give up," Jake said quietly. "No," Tom agreed, "which means we need to be ready for escalation." That night, after Sarah and Jake had gone to bed in their childhood rooms and Elena had returned to town, Tom sat on the porch with Scout at his feet, sharing the evening watch. The weight of responsibility pressed down on him like a physical presence. His family was now involved in something dangerous because of his decisions, and the knowledge that his actions might put them at risk warred with his determination to see justice done. Scout seemed to sense his internal conflict. The pup pressed against his leg, offering comfort that felt like absolution. "I don't know if I'm doing the right thing," Tom admitted aloud. "Maybe Sarah was right. Maybe we should turn everything over to the authorities and hope for the best." Scout looked up at him with those impossibly intelligent eyes, and Tom could swear he saw understanding there, not just animal loyalty, but genuine comprehension of the moral complexity they faced. The answer came the next morning in the form of a phone call that changed everything. Tom Greeley. The voice was different from the previous threats. Younger, more nervous. Speaking. "This is about your daughter in Dallas, Sarah Mitchell, lives at 4247 Oakmont Drive with her husband and 2 kids. Tom's blood turned to ice. "What about her? She's got a nice routine. Drops the kids at school every morning at 7:30, stops for coffee at that place on Henderson Street, gets to work by 8:15, predictable, vulnerable. If you touch my family, nobody has to get hurt, old man. Just return what you took, forget what you've seen, and everybody goes back to their normal lives." The line went dead. Tom stood frozen in his kitchen, phone in hand, while rage and terror fought for dominance in his chest. These people had crossed a line that transformed this from a matter of principle into a war for survival. Scout had gone absolutely still during the conversation, every muscle in his body coiled with tension. When Tom looked down, he found the pup staring at him with an expression that seemed almost human in its understanding of the threat. "They threatened Sarah," Tom said aloud. Scout's response was immediate and unmistakable, a low growl built in his chest. Not the sound of a pet, but the voice of a predator accepting a challenge. His hackles rose, and for a moment, Tom glimpsed the wildness that still existed beneath the intelligence and loyalty. Tom called Sarah immediately, catching her as she was getting ready for work. "Sweetheart, I need you to listen carefully and not ask questions until I'm finished." He explained the threat, watching through the window as Scout patrolled the yard with newfound purpose. His daughter's silence stretched long enough for Tom to wonder if the call had dropped. "Dad," Sarah finally said, her voice tight with controlled fear, "they know where my children go to school. I know. Which is why you and the kids are coming here today. Right now, I can't just leave work. I have responsibilities, Sarah. Tom's voice carried the authority of a man who'd commanded soldiers in combat. "Your responsibilities are to stay alive and keep my grandchildren safe. Everything else is secondary." While Sarah packed and arranged emergency leave from her job, Tom called Jake and Elena. Within 2 hours, his kitchen had been transformed into a command center, with electronic equipment, surveillance gear, and tactical planning materials covering every available surface. Scout had appointed himself chief of security, positioning himself where he could monitor all approaches to the house while remaining close enough to protect the family. His behavior had shifted from pet-like companionship to something more primal and focused. He seemed to understand that the rules had changed, that they were now in active danger. "He knows," Elena observed, watching Scout test the air with systematic thoroughness. "Animals have senses we don't fully understand. He's detecting something, maybe chemical traces, maybe just changes in our stress levels, but he's definitely aware that a threat is imminent." Jake nodded towards Scout, who had positioned himself by the window overlooking the driveway. "Look at his body language. That's a sentry posture. He's not just watching, he's preparing to defend." When Sarah arrived with her children, Emily, 8, and David, 6, Scout's demeanor shifted again. He approached the children with gentle curiosity, allowing them to pet him while maintaining his awareness of potential threats. The kids were enchanted by their grandfather's unusual companion, and their innocent delight provided a momentary respite from the tension that permeated the house. "Why does Scout keep looking out the windows, Grandpa?" Emily asked, stroking. "The pup's thick fur. He's making sure we're all safe, sweetheart. He's very good at that." David, with the directness of childhood, asked the question that had been haunting Tom. "Are the bad people coming here?" Tom knelt beside his grandson, choosing honesty over false comfort. "Maybe. But if they do, Scout and I will protect you. That's what families do. We take care of each other." As if understanding the promise being made, Scout moved to David's side and sat perfectly still, allowing the little boy to lean against him for comfort. That evening, as Tom conducted his final security check before bed, Scout exhibited behavior that defied rational explanation. The pup led him to 3 different locations around the property, pausing at each spot to test the air with intense concentration. At each location, Tom found subtle signs of recent surveillance: disturbed grass, cigarette residue, or the faint chemical smell of equipment. Scout hadn't just detected these intrusions. He'd catalogued them, creating a mental map of enemy activity that would have impressed professional military scouts. How is that possible? Tom wondered aloud. Scout looked at him with those unsettling yellow eyes, and Tom realized he might never fully understand the intelligence he'd rescued from Morrison's auction. Whatever breeding program had created Scout had produced something far beyond an ordinary animal, a creature that combined natural instincts with enhanced cognitive abilities. As they returned to the house, Scout paused at the door and looked back across the darkened ranch. His body language conveyed a message that needed no translation. "Let them come. We're ready." Tom understood that they'd moved beyond the possibility of peaceful resolution. The traffickers had threatened his family, which meant the gloves were coming off. Tomorrow, he would begin fighting back with every skill he'd learned in 30 years of military service, and Scout would be right beside him, proving that loyalty and intelligence were more powerful than greed and intimidation. Elena arrived at dawn with a manila envelope that would change everything Tom thought he knew about Scout, his property, and his wife's death. She moved with the tense urgency of someone carrying information too dangerous to discuss over the phone, and her expression held the grim weight of a professional who'd uncovered something that made her question everything she thought she understood about her work. "We need to talk," she said without preamble, settling at the kitchen table where the family had been planning their defense. "All of us." Sarah and Jake emerged from their bedrooms, drawn by the tone in Elena's voice that suggested this wasn't routine veterinary business. Scout positioned himself where he could observe the conversation, those intelligent yellow eyes tracking between speakers as if following the discussion. Elena opened the envelope and spread its contents across the table. Scientific reports. "Genetic analyses," and correspondence that looked more like intelligence briefings than veterinary documents. At the center of the pile lay a single sheet of paper labeled Genetic Analysis, Specimen SC001. Scout's DNA results came back, Elena began, her voice carefully controlled. What I found is worse than I imagined. Tom studied the genetic report, trying to make sense of scientific terminology that seemed designed to obscure rather than clarify. What exactly are we looking at? Scout isn't just a wolf-dog hybrid. He's been specifically engineered. Elena pointed to a section highlighting genetic markers. Someone used advanced breeding techniques to create an animal with enhanced intelligence, docile temperament, and physical characteristics that make him extremely valuable in the exotic pet trade. Jake leaned forward, his technical background helping him pass the scientific jargon. You're talking about genetic manipulation, like selective breeding on steroids. Exactly. This level of genetic optimization doesn't happen by accident. Scout represents years of research, careful breeding selection, and significant financial investment. Elena's expression was grim. Based on these markers, I'd estimate he's worth at least $25,000 to collectors who want exotic pets with domestic animal temperaments. Sarah made notes on her laptop, building the legal case even as the personal implications became clear. So Scout wasn't just abandoned, he was valuable property that went missing. More than that. Eleanor pulled out additional documents. Shipping, manifests, veterinary records, and communication transcripts that had been forwarded by contacts in law enforcement. I've been coordinating with wildlife investigators, and Scout was part of a much larger operation. He was one of 15 animals in a shipment that was intercepted by authorities in Oklahoma 3 months ago. Tom felt the world shift beneath him. Intercepted? The traffickers were transporting exotic animals from breeding facilities to buyers across the country. When law enforcement moved in, the criminals scattered, abandoning vehicles and cargo to avoid capture. Eleanor's voice grew harder. Scout was supposed to be in that shipment. The fact that he ended up at Morrison's auction means someone retrieved him and was moving him through an alternate network. Jake was studying property maps on his tablet, cross-referencing Elena's information with their surveillance findings. Dad, look at this. If they were using our property as a way station after the Oklahoma bust, it means my ranch was specifically chosen, Tom finished. They knew about Martha's death, knew I was isolated and unlikely to notice. Activity on my own land. The implications hit him like physical blows. These people hadn't randomly selected his property. They'd researched him, studied his routines, and calculated that a grief-stricken widower would make an ideal, unwitting partner in their criminal enterprise. Elena nodded toward Scout, who was listening to the conversation with that uncanny awareness. His intelligence isn't natural, Tom. It's the result of selective breeding for traits that make exotic pets appealing to wealthy collectors. He's been designed to be smarter than a normal wolf, more loyal than a typical dog, and physically impressive. Enough to satisfy people who want to own something wild, but he escaped somehow. Or was left behind when the operation went wrong. These trafficking networks move quickly when threatened. If they thought Scout was compromised or too recognizable, they might have planned to dispose of him rather than risk exposure. Sarah looked up from her laptop, her legal training helping her see patterns the others missed. The timing fits. Scout appeared at Morrison's auction just days after you called Dad about finding tracks on the property. If they were using the ranch as a way station and something spooked them, they dumped the evidence, Tom concluded, including Scout. Elena pulled out the most damning document, a veterinary record with Scout's breeding information and ownership. History. This is where it gets personal, Tom. According to these records, Scout was specifically bred for a buyer who requested enhanced intelligence and tracking abilities. Someone wanted a wolf that could serve as both companion and security. Animal. Tom studied the document, noting dates and locations that painted a picture of Scout's life before the auction. Where was he bred? a facility in Montana that was raided by federal agents last year. The owner disappeared, but not before destroying most of his records. Elena's expression was grave. However, some documentation survived, including correspondence about using rural properties in Texas as temporary holding facilities for animals in transport. Jake was tracking information on his tablet, correlating Elena's findings with their own intelligence. Dad, there's something else. I've been monitoring radio frequencies in the area, and I'm picking up encrypted communications that suggest active coordination between multiple parties. What kind of communications? Military-grade equipment, rotating frequencies, code words. This isn't amateur hour. These people have the resources and training of a professional operation. Elena reached into her folder and pulled out a photograph that made Tom's blood run cold. It showed Martha talking to a man beside a dark pickup truck, the image apparently taken with a telephoto lens from a considerable distance. This was in the files I received from law enforcement. It was taken 6 months before Martha's death. Tom stared at the photograph, recognizing the location as the far corner of his property, where Martha often walked to observe wildlife. The man in the image was the same person who'd threatened him at the ranch, the older trafficker who'd warned him about accidents happening to people who lived alone. They were watching her, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. The correspondence suggests they were concerned about her wildlife observations. Martha had been documenting unusual animal activity, and some of her journal entries were getting attention from local conservation groups. Sarah reached across the table to touch her father's hand. Dad, what are you thinking? Tom was quiet for a long moment, pieces of a puzzle finally clicking into place in his mind. Martha's growing concern about wildlife disappearances, her secretive phone calls in the months before her diagnosis, the way she'd started looking over her shoulder when they drove to town, the unusual aggressiveness of her cancer, which had defied every treatment and progressed faster than medical experts expected. I'm thinking my wife didn't die of natural causes, he said finally. The silence that followed was profound. Elena, with her veterinary training, understood the implications. Immediately, Jake's military electronics experience had taught him about sophisticated methods of causing undetectable harm. Sarah's legal background helped her recognize the pattern of threat elimination that criminal organizations employed to protect their interests. Scout moved closer to Tom, pressing against his leg in a gesture that felt like both comfort and solidarity. The pup had lost his freedom to these same people, had been bred and manipulated for their profit, and had somehow survived their disposal when he became inconvenient. We can't prove it, Sarah said quietly. No, Tom agreed, but we can stop them from doing it to anyone else. Elena gathered her documents, her expression reflecting the weight of professional responsibility. Tom, if your suspicions are correct, these people are capable of anything. Martha was killed because she threatened their operation. They won't hesitate to eliminate you and your family if you become a similar threat. Then we better make sure we eliminate them first. Jake looked up from his equipment. Dad, I'm reading significant electronic activity in the area, multiple vehicles, coordinated movement patterns. They're not just watching us anymore, they're positioning for something. Tom moved to the window, scanning the horizon with eyes trained by decades of military service. The ranch looked peaceful in the morning light, but he could feel the weight of hostile observation like a physical presence. Scout joined him at the window, hackles rising as he detected something beyond human perception. His body language was unmistakable. Danger was approaching, and it was time to choose between flight and fight. Tom made his choice the way soldiers always had, by thinking about what he was protecting rather than what he was risking. Martha deserved justice. Scout deserved freedom from the people who'd created him for profit and abandoned him when he became inconvenient. His family deserved to live without fear. Elena, I need you to take all this evidence and get it to federal authorities. Use your veterinary contacts, wildlife investigators, anyone who has jurisdiction over this kind of operation. What about you? Tom looked down at Scout, whose intelligent eyes reflected an understanding that seemed almost human. Scout and I are going to buy you time. These people want him back, and they're willing to come here to get him. That gives us the advantage of choosing the battlefield." Sarah stood up, her face set with the determination she'd inherited from both parents. "We're not leaving you to face this alone." "Yes, you are. You and Jake are taking the kids to Elena's clinic in town, where there are witnesses and security cameras. This ends here, on my property, with my rules." Jake was monitoring his electronic equipment, noting increased activity across multiple frequencies. "Dad, whatever's coming, it's happening soon. I'm reading at least 4 vehicles converging on our location." Tom nodded, feeling the familiar calm that preceded combat. "Then we better get ready to give them the welcome they deserve." Scout moved to the door, every muscle coiled for action despite his healing injuries. His message was clear. Whatever Tom was planning, he would be part of it. They'd saved each other once, and now they would fight for each other, as his family, prepared to leave for safety, and Elena gathered evidence that might bring justice for Martha. Tom found himself looking at Scout with new understanding. This remarkable animal wasn't just a victim of human greed. He was a survivor who'd overcome genetic manipulation, criminal exploitation, and abandonment to find loyalty and purpose. Together, they would prove that some bonds couldn't be broken by profit margins or intimidation. The traffickers had created Scout to be a commodity, but they'd accidentally created something far more dangerous, a partner who would fight to the death for the man who'd given him freedom. The war was about to begin, and Tom Greeley finally understood what he was really fighting for. Not just justice for his wife or protection for his family, but the principle that some things were too precious to be bought and sold. Scout seemed to understand as well. His low growl carried a promise that echoed Tom's own determination. "Let them come. We'll be ready." The decision came to Tom with the clarity that only emerges when all other options have been exhausted. As he watched his family prepare to leave for the safety of Elena's clinic, he understood that running would only delay the inevitable confrontation. These people had killed Martha, threatened his children, and turned innocent animals into commodities. The time for half measures and hoping for outside intervention had passed. "Jake, before you go, I need your help with something." Tom led his son to the dining room table, where he spread a detailed topographical map of the ranch across the familiar surface. Using a red pen, he began marking positions with the systematic precision of a man who'd planned military operations in hostile territory. "This is going to be their approach route," he said, drawing arrows from the county road through the concealed access points they'd discovered during their surveillance. "They'll want to control the high ground here and here, which gives them sight lines to the house and barn." Jake studied the map with professional interest, his Navy training helping him understand the tactical considerations. "What about escape routes if things go wrong?" "That's where Scout comes in." Tom marked additional positions on the map. "He knows every trail, every hiding spot, every defensible position on this property. If I have to fall back, he can guide me to places they'll never find." Sarah approached the table, her face set with the stubborn determination that reminded Tom so much of her mother. "Dad, this is insane. You're talking about fighting professional criminals with military training. I'm talking about using the advantages I have." Tom's finger traced defensive positions on the map. "This is my ground, my rules. They have to come to me, which means I choose the battlefield." Elena had been listening from the kitchen doorway, her veterinary bag packed and ready. "Tom, I've contacted every law enforcement agency with jurisdiction. Sheriff's Department, State Police, Federal Wildlife Investigators. They're coordinating a response, but it's going to take time." "How much time?" 12 to 18 hours. For a properly coordinated federal response, maybe 6 hours for local backup. Tom looked at his battle plan map, calculating timing against the electronic activity Jake had been monitoring. "They're not going to wait that long. Jake's reading suggests they're moving tonight." Jake nodded grimly. "The communications have shifted to operational frequencies. Whatever they're planning, it's happening soon." Tom made the decision that would define everything that followed. "Then we give them what they want. Scout and I stay here and draw their attention while you get that evidence to federal authorities. When law enforcement finally arrives, they'll find enough proof to shut down the entire network. And if something happens to you," Sarah's voice was tight with barely controlled fear, "then you make sure Martha's death wasn't meaningless. You make sure Scout's story gets told. And you teach my grandchildren that sometimes you have to stand up to bullies, no matter how powerful they are." The next hour was devoted to preparations that felt like both military planning and family farewell. Tom retrieved weapons from the gun safe that hadn't been opened since hunting season. His service pistol, a hunting rifle with a high-powered scope, and ammunition that he checked with the automatic precision of old training. Scout watched the preparations with intense focus, seeming to understand that the routine medical care and quiet recovery were ending, replaced by something that required different skills. When Tom began explaining basic tactical movement to his grandchildren, Scout positioned himself as part of the lesson. "Emily, David, this is important," Tom said, kneeling beside his grandchildren in the living room. "If you ever hear loud noises, or see Uncle Jake moving quickly, what do? Get small and quiet," Emily recited, practicing the low crawl Tom had taught her. "Find the safe place," David added, pointing to the reinforced closet Tom had designated as their emergency shelter. "And stay there until someone we trust comes to get you," they finished together. Scout demonstrated his own understanding by moving between the children and the windows, placing himself as a barrier against potential threats. His protective instincts had evolved beyond simple loyalty. He was now actively anticipating danger and positioning himself to intercept it. Tom spent time working with Scout on hand signals and movement commands, building on the intelligence that breeding had enhanced, but experience was sharpening. The pup learned to distinguish between patrol signals and combat commands, understanding when to scout ahead and when to remain in protective position. "He's not just smart," Tom told Elena as they watched Scout practice silent movement through the house. "He's tactical. Someone bred him to understand complex operations, which makes him invaluable as a partner," Elena replied. "But it also makes him irreplaceable to the people who created him. They're not just coming for property, they're coming for a prototype that represents years of research." As afternoon turned to evening, Jake's electronic monitoring confirmed Tom's worst fears. "Dad, I'm reading coordinated movement from 4 different sources. They're staging for a major operation." "How major?" Jake showed him the tablet displaying signal patterns and frequency analysis, based on the communication volume and coordination. "Complexity, I'd estimate at least 12 people, multiple vehicles, and professional-grade equipment. This isn't just a recovery mission, it's an assault." Tom studied the data, his military experience helping him understand the implications. "They're not planning to negotiate. They're planning to eliminate witnesses and recover their property by force." "Which means we need to get everyone out of here now," Sarah said, her legal training shifting into crisis mode. But Tom was already shaking his head. "If we all leave, they'll burn down the house, destroy any evidence we haven't yet documented, and disappear. By the time federal agents arrive, there won't be anything left to investigate. And if you stay, they'll kill you." "Maybe, but they'll have to work for it, and that gives law enforcement time to respond." Tom looked around the room at his family. "This is the only way to ensure they face justice for what they did to Martha." Elena stepped forward, her professional composure cracking slightly. "Tom, there has to be another option. You're talking about suicide." "I'm talking about using the skills I was trained for, about making a stand on ground I know better than anyone alive." Tom's voice carried the quiet confidence of a man who'd made his choice. "Scout and I have advantages they don't expect. We're going to make them pay for every foot of my property they try to take." As his family prepared for departure, Tom conducted a final weapons check with the methodical thoroughness of a soldier preparing for combat. Each weapon was cleaned, loaded, and positioned at strategic locations throughout the house. Ammunition was distributed to ensure he could maintain resistance even if forced to move between positions. Scout had assumed sentry duty by the front windows, his enhanced senses monitoring approaches that human perception couldn't detect. Occasionally, he would alert Tom to sounds or scents that suggested reconnaissance activity, confirming that the property was already under surveillance. "They're watching us," Tom told Jake as they finished the final equipment checks. "I know. I'm reading electronic signatures from observation posts on 3 sides of the property." "Good. That means they're predictable. They're following standard protocols for this kind of operation." Tom's battle plan was elegantly simple. Use Scout's intelligence and mobility to conduct harassment operations while falling back through prepared positions. The goal wasn't to win a conventional battle, but to delay the opposition long enough for law enforcement to arrive and preserve evidence long enough for prosecution. Sarah approached her father as the family prepared to leave, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "Dad, I love you, and I'm proud of what you're doing even though I'm terrified." "I love you too, sweetheart. Take care of those grandchildren for me." Jake embraced his father with the fierce intensity of men who understood they might never see each other again. "I should stay. You need backup. I need you to protect your sister and her kids. That's more important than anything else." Elena was the last to say goodbye, carrying the evidence that might bring justice for Martha and freedom for countless animals. "Tom, Scout is more than just intelligent. He's bonded to you in ways that transcend normal animal behavior. That bond is your greatest asset." As if understanding the conversation, Scout moved to Tom's side, pressing against his leg with the solid reassurance of partnership. His yellow eyes reflected not just loyalty, but a kind of grim determination that seemed almost human. After his family departed, Tom and Scout conducted a final perimeter check, noting the positions of the surveillance teams and calculating their response times. The traffickers were professional, but they were operating on unfamiliar ground, against an opponent who'd spent 30 years learning every detail of this terrain. "Well, partner," Tom said as they returned to the house, "it's just us now. Think we can give them a fight they'll remember?" Scout's response was a low growl that carried the promise of violence, not the mindless aggression of a frightened animal, but the controlled menace of a predator that had chosen its battleground. As darkness fell across the Texas countryside, Tom made his final preparations. Weapons positioned, communications established with law enforcement, escape routes planned, and contingencies prepared. Scout had taken position by the window where he could monitor the primary approach route, his entire body radiating the focused attention of a sentry on watch. The electronic signals Jake had been monitoring suddenly went quiet, the pause that preceded coordinated action. Tom checked his weapons one final time, ensuring each was ready for immediate use. In the distance, the sound of approaching vehicles carried across the still night air, multiple engines moving without headlights, following the concealed routes that Scout had helped map during their reconnaissance missions. Tom looked down at his unlikely partner, whose intelligent eyes reflected starlight and determination. "Ready?" Scout's tail gave a single controlled wag, not excitement, but acknowledgement. Whatever happened next, they would face it together. The war had come to the Greeley Ranch, and Tom felt more alive than he had since Martha's death. For the first time in 3 years, he had something worth fighting for, and someone worth fighting beside. Let them come. They came at 2:17 a.m., just as Tom had predicted they would, during the darkest hours when most people slept deepest and emergency response. Time stretched longest. Scout's ears had been twitching for 20 minutes, picking up sounds beyond human perception, when the first vehicles finally became audible to Tom's trained hearing. 4 trucks approached through the concealed routes, their engines muffled, but still detectable to someone who knew how to listen. Tom adjusted his night vision goggles and activated the military-grade radio communications device he'd retrieved from his old equipment cache, the same model he'd used to coordinate operations in Afghanistan, modified to work with civilian law enforcement frequencies. "Alpha Base, this is Greeley Ranch," he whispered into the headset. "Package delivery is commencing. 4 vehicles, estimated 12 to 15 personnel." Sheriff Martinez's voice crackled back through the encrypted channel. "Copy, Greeley Ranch. Units are positioned but maintaining distance per your request. You sure about this approach?" Roger. These people need to commit to their operation before we spring the trap. Otherwise, they'll scatter and we'll lose the evidence. Scout moved silently to Tom's side, his body language indicating maximum alertness. The pup's enhanced senses were tracking multiple threats simultaneously, a living early warning system that provided intelligence no technology could match. Tom had positioned himself in the barn loft where he could observe the primary approach. Routes while remaining concealed. Scout's job was to monitor the house and alert Tom to any attempts at flanking or infiltration. They'd rehearsed the procedures during the afternoon, and Scout had demonstrated an understanding of tactical movement that would have impressed military working dog handlers. The first truck stopped at the tree line, disgorging 4 men who moved. With professional discipline, Tom recognized the older trafficker who'd threatened his family, now directing the operation with hand signals that indicated military or law enforcement training. These weren't casual criminals. They were professionals conducting a systematic assault. Through his night vision scope, Tom watched the team establish a perimeter around the house, while 2 additional trucks positioned themselves to block potential escape routes. The 4th vehicle remained hidden near the county road, probably serving as command post and extraction point. Professional setup, Tom murmured into his radio. These people know what they're doing. Copy. Still maintaining overwatch? Affirmative. Let them commit fully before we respond. The assault team moved toward the house with textbook precision. 2-man teams providing mutual cover while advancing through concealment. Tom had anticipated this approach, which was why he'd left lights on in the kitchen and positioned decoy targets to suggest normal occupancy. Scout had gone absolutely still, his yellow eyes tracking movement that Tom couldn't yet see. Suddenly, the pup's head turned toward the east side of the property, and Tom understood the message. Additional threats approaching from an unexpected direction. Alpha Base, possible additional contacts from the east. Scouts detecting movement beyond my visual range. Copy. We have thermal imaging showing 2 additional personnel moving through the tree line approximately 300 meters from your position. The revelation confirmed Tom's suspicions about the sophistication of this operation. They weren't just attempting to recover Scout, they were conducting a coordinated assault designed to eliminate witnesses and destroy evidence. Tom activated the motion sensor lights he'd positioned around the property, suddenly illuminating the assault team in harsh white light. The tactical advantage of darkness disappeared instantly, leaving the attackers exposed and confused. Now, Tom commanded into his radio. Sheriff's Department vehicles converged from 3 directions simultaneously, their spotlights creating a web of illumination that trapped the traffickers in overlapping fields of fire. The coordination was flawless. Months of planning condensed into 30 seconds of perfectly executed law enforcement response. Most of the assault team surrendered immediately when faced with overwhelming odds, but the older trafficker and 2 companions made a desperate run toward the house where they believed Scout was hidden. This was the scenario Tom had prepared for, the moment when negotiation ended and violence became inevitable. Scout erupted from concealment with the explosive speed of his wolf heritage, intercepting the lead attacker before the man could reach the porch. The impact sent both figures tumbling, but Scout recovered instantly while the trafficker struggled to regain his footing. "Federal agents, drop your weapons!" The voice belonged to Agent Rebecca Torres from U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, Elena's contact, who had coordinated the multi-agency response. The older trafficker ignored the commands, raising his weapon toward Tom's position in the barn loft. Scout's response was immediate and devastating, a leap that covered 15 feet in a single bound, striking the gunman with enough force to shatter his aim and send the weapon spinning into darkness. Tom dropped from the loft using a rope he'd positioned for quick deployment, landing behind cover as the remaining traffickers realized their situation had become hopeless. The combination of law enforcement response and Scout's protective intervention had transformed their planned assault into a tactical disaster. "This is Tom Greeley," he announced over his radio. "Primary threats neutralized. Scout is securing the area." Agent Torres approached the barn with her weapon drawn, but pointed safely downward. Mr. Greeley, we need you and Scout to stand down so we can process the scene. Tom emerged from cover with his hands visible, Scout moving to his side. With the disciplined precision of a military working dog, the pup showed no aggression toward law enforcement, but his attention remained focused on the captured traffickers. Outstanding work, Sheriff Martinez said, surveying the scene. Your intelligence was perfect. We've got the entire operational team plus enough evidence to prosecute the whole network. The arrested traffickers were processed with the efficiency of law enforcement officers who understood the significance of this bust. Vehicle searches revealed crates designed for animal transport, veterinary supplies for maintaining specimens during transit, and most importantly, documentation that linked this operation to trafficking networks across multiple states. Jake's voice crackled through Tom's radio headset. Dad, we're monitoring law enforcement frequencies from town. Sounds like you got them all. Affirmative. Scout performed perfectly. How are Sarah and the kids? Safe and proud. Sarah wants to know if you're injured. Tom looked down at Scout, whose tail was wagging with the satisfaction of a job well done. Tell her we're both fine. Mission accomplished. Agent Torres examined the evidence they'd recovered, her expression reflecting professional satisfaction mixed with personal gratitude. Mr. Greeley, this operation will shut down trafficking networks that have been operating for years. The documentation we've seized will lead to prosecutions across multiple jurisdictions, and the animals they've been exploiting will be relocated to proper sanctuaries where they can live without being commodities. Torres looked at Scout with new understanding. Including your partner there, though I suspect he's found the sanctuary he was looking for. Tom knelt beside Scout, stroking the pup's thick fur while law enforcement officers secured the crime. The scene around them. No, he's home. We both are. The older trafficker was loaded into a police vehicle, his professional composure finally cracking as he realized the scope of his legal troubles. Before the door closed, he looked back at Tom with undisguised hatred. This isn't over, old man. Scout's response was a low growl that carried unmistakable menace. The message was clear. Anyone who threatened Tom would have to go through him first, and that was a fight they would lose. As dawn approached and the last of the evidence was catalogued, Tom understood that they'd accomplished something more significant than just stopping one trafficking operation. They'd proven that justice was still possible when ordinary people refused to accept criminal exploitation of the innocent. Scout pressed against his leg, offering the quiet companionship that had transformed both their lives. Together, they'd fought for Martha's memory, for the freedom of countless animals, and for the principle that some things were worth any risk. The trap had worked perfectly, but more importantly, they'd discovered that healing was possible even after terrible loss. Sometimes it just required finding something worth fighting for and someone worth fighting beside. Just as Tom began to believe the crisis was over, the older trafficker, identified by Agent Torres as Marcus Kellerman, a former military contractor with connections to international wildlife smuggling, made his desperate final play. While being loaded into the police vehicle, Kellerman managed to slip his restraints using techniques that spoke to professional training in escape and evasion. In one fluid motion, he overpowered the transporting officer, seized the man's service weapon, and turned toward Tom with the cold determination of someone who had nothing left to lose. You destroyed everything I built, old man, Kellerman snarled, raising the pistol. If I'm going down, you're coming with me. Time slowed with the crystalline clarity that Tom remembered from combat. Every detail sharp and immediate, every option calculated in the space of a heartbeat. He was too far from cover, too exposed to avoid the shot, and Kellerman was too experienced to miss at this range. Scout moved before Tom could even process the threat. The pup launched himself across 20 feet of open ground with the explosive power of his wolf heritage, covering the distance in a single bound that defied the limitations of his still-healing injuries. He struck Kellerman at chest height just as the gun fired, the impact deflecting the shot harmlessly into the night sky. Both figures went down in a tangle of limbs and fury, but Scout had momentum and determination on his side. His jaws locked, onto Kellerman's gun hand with the precision of a predator who understood exactly where to apply pressure, forcing the weapon to drop as the trafficker screamed in pain and rage. Tom rushed forward, his service pistol drawn and ready, but Scout had the situation under control. The pup held Kellerman immobilized with the efficient ruthlessness of a military working dog, applying just enough pressure to prevent escape without causing permanent damage. "Easy, Scout," Tom called softly. "I've got him now." Scout released his grip immediately, stepping back but remaining alert for any additional threats. It was then that Tom noticed the dark stain spreading across the pup's left shoulder. Kellerman's shot hadn't missed entirely. "Scout's hit," Tom called out, fear replacing tactical awareness as he knelt beside his wounded partner. Agent Torres was beside them instantly, her emergency medical training taking over as she assessed the injury. "Flesh wound, but he's losing blood. We need to get him to a veterinarian immediately." Tom felt panic rise in his chest as he watched Scout's strength ebb, the pup's breathing becoming labored as shock set in. After everything they'd been through together, the thought of losing Scout to a final act of vindictive violence was unbearable. Elena's voice crackled through his radio headset. "Tom, we're en route to your location with emergency veterinary supplies." Jake monitored the gunshot on police frequencies. "How bad is Scout's injury?" "Shoulder wound, bleeding heavily," Tom reported, applying pressure with a field dressing from his tactical kit. "He saved my life, Elena. Don't let him die for it." Scout looked up at Tom with those intelligent yellow eyes, and even in his weakened state, the pup managed a slight wag of his tail, reassurance that he understood the risk had been worthwhile. Tom reached into his pocket and pulled out Martha's wedding ring, which he'd been carrying since her death as a talisman against loneliness. He'd planned to be buried wearing it, but now he understood its true purpose. Slipping the ring onto his finger for the first time since the funeral, he felt Martha's presence as if she was standing beside him. "You stay with us, Scout," he whispered, stroking the pup's head. "Martha would never forgive me if I let anything happen to you now." As if responding to the invocation of Martha's memory, Scout's breathing steadied slightly. The bond between them had transcended simple companionship. They'd become family in the deepest sense, united by shared sacrifice and mutual protection. Sarah and Jake arrived with Elena just as law enforcement was securing the last of the evidence that would destroy the trafficking network permanently. The documentation they'd seized revealed connections to operations across the country, potentially saving hundreds of animals from exploitation and abuse. "Dad!" Sarah called out, running toward them despite the crime scene chaos around her. Jake was right behind her, carrying medical supplies that Elena directed him to deploy immediately. The family worked together with practiced efficiency, demonstrating that the bonds forged during their crisis had created something stronger than they'd possessed before Martha's death. Elena's examination revealed that while Scout's injury was serious, it was far from fatal. The bullet passed through muscle tissue without hitting bone or major blood vessels, she reported. "He'll need surgery and extended recovery, but he's going to be fine." Tom felt relief wash over him like physical warmth. "You hear that, Scout? You're going to be okay." Scout's tail wagged weakly in response, and Tom could swear he saw understanding in those remarkable eyes. Not just animal comprehension, but genuine awareness of what they'd accomplished together. Agent Torres approached, with the final tally of their success. "Mr. Greeley, we've arrested 17 people directly involved in this operation. Plus, we have evidence linking them to trafficking networks in 8 states. This bust is going to shut down operations that have been exploiting wildlife for decades. And Scout will be credited as a law enforcement asset whose intelligence made this operation possible. There's paperwork involved, but he's legally yours now. No one can ever take him away again." Sheriff Martinez surveyed the scene with professional satisfaction. "Tom, I've been in law enforcement for 25 years, and I've never seen civilian cooperation this effective. You and Scout make one hell of a team." As Elena supervised Scout's transfer to her clinic for emergency surgery, Tom found himself looking across his property with new eyes. The ranch that had felt like a monument to loss and isolation was now the site of victory over organized criminal exploitation. Martha's memory had been honored, innocent animals would be saved, and his family had been reunited through shared purpose. Kellerman was loaded into a federal transport vehicle, his dreams of criminal empire reduced to charges that would ensure. He spent the rest of his life in prison. Before the doors closed, he looked at Tom one final time. "You got lucky, old man." Tom adjusted Martha's wedding ring on his finger, feeling the weight of love that transcended death. "No, I got family. There's a difference." As dawn broke over the Texas countryside, painting the sky in the colors Martha had always called God's promise of new beginnings, Tom understood that he'd found something he'd thought was lost forever. Purpose that extended beyond mere survival. Scout would recover, stronger than before, and free from the exploitation that had defined his early life. The trafficking network would be dismantled, its leaders facing justice for crimes against both animals and the natural world they'd corrupted for profit. Most importantly, Tom Greeley had rediscovered that healing was possible even after devastating loss. Sometimes it just required the courage to fight for something bigger than yourself, and the wisdom to recognize that family could be found in the most unexpected places. The war was over, and for the first time since Martha's death, Tom was genuinely looking forward to tomorrow. 6 months later, Tom stood on the same porch where he'd once sat in bitter solitude. But everything had changed. The morning coffee in his hands was no longer a ritual of loneliness. It was preparation for a day filled with purpose and surrounded by the family he'd thought was lost forever. Scout emerged from the house, moving with the confident grace of complete recovery. The shoulder injury had healed without complications, leaving only a small scar beneath his thick fur as a reminder of the night he'd saved Tom's life. The pup had grown into his full size during the intervening months, now standing nearly 30 inches at the shoulder with the dignified bearing of a mature wolf dog, whose intelligence had been liberated from exploitation and allowed to flourish in freedom. "Morning, partner," Tom said, scratching behind Scout's ears, in the ritual that had begun every day since their first week together. "Ready for another busy one?" Scout's response was the same tail wag and alert expression that meant yes, he was ready for whatever the day might bring. Their communication had evolved beyond words into the kind of understanding that developed between partners who'd faced danger together and chosen to build something better from their shared survival. The ranch itself bore evidence of transformation that went far beyond cosmetic improvements. Under Elena's guidance, and with funding from wildlife conservation grants, Tom's property had become the Greeley Wildlife Sanctuary, a legitimate refuge for animals rescued from illegal trafficking. Operations across the Southwest